Good evening. My name is Keith Marks. I'm the Executive Director at Next Stage Arts Project in Putney, Vermont. We appreciate you tuning in to this edition of, we're looking at the ratification of the 19th Amendment with Dr. Meg Mott, Votes for All Women. This is one of the things that Next Stage is looking at doing in terms of programming through the COVID pandemic, where we are looking to bring the experience of being in the theater into your home and into your computers, through your computers. We appreciate you tuning in. We appreciate everybody who has supported Next Stage through registering for this event, sharing this event. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our co-presenters. We want to thank the Vermont Suffrage Centennial Alliance. We also wish to thank the Commons, Windham County's independent source for news, and we also definitely want to give a big shout out to Brattleboro Community Television, who's handling all of the tech for this evening. This really could not be possible without BCTV, so we want to say thank you to all of our co-presenters. Right now we have Dr. Meg Mott, who's going to come on with our guest speakers speaking about the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Dr. Mott is a professor of politics emeritus. She is the town moderator for Putney, and she is a self-described constitutional wrangler. Without further ado, Dr. Meg Mott and Votes for All Women. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. I also want to thank Keith Marks and Robin Stern for asking me to talk about the 19th Amendment here at the Next Stage, and to Ellen Lovell for recommending me to Robin Stern. It's a great honor to be here. I call myself a Constitution wrangler. Well, first of all, when you retire, it's kind of an identity problem. Exactly what are you? I didn't have students anymore to teach, but I still had this document that I cared a lot about, the US Constitution. And after the 2016 election, when there was a lot of division, there has always, and just as a side note, there has always been a lot of division in the United States. John Adams passes the Alien and Sedition Act. Other people are trying to get rid of John Adams because he's trying to get rid of other people. So I don't want to make it sound like this is completely new. I know people say unprecedented all the time, but the reason I go back to the Constitution and I'm interested in American history is that yes, things change, and also they stay the same. So when I go around to different places to talk about the Constitution, it's usually, I imagine, easy to find a disagreement. So the First Amendment, freedom of speech, or the Second Amendment, right to bear arms. People have a lot to say about it. They have positions on one side, and they have positions on the other. And I like having formats like this because then people get to hear each other. They don't have to endorse each other's positions, but they get to hear each other. And that's how I understand the genius of democracy. We fight, we're a disagreeable species, we disagree all the time, and the Constitution gives us more reasons to disagree, because there's a lot of confusing things in here. I called this Votes for All Women, Perseverance, Patience, and Politics, because I'm interested in virtue and in politics. Patience, perseverance, those are clearly virtues. But politics, usually people think, that's kind of dirty, isn't it? What is virtuous about politics? Well, the original idea of politics, and this comes from Aristotle, very, very old idea, 300 BC, and that is that politics gives us the possibility of becoming a better person. We have to make arguments, we need to use evidence, we have to make persuasive arguments that appeal to people's hearts. And through doing that, from learning from each other, from arguing with each other, Aristotle thought we would become better people. In fact, at one point he says, if the people are not degraded, if you get them together in a room and they start deliberating, they will be smarter than the experts. He was talking about juries, but the same is true for politics in general. The more we work to explain ourselves to somebody else, the better we become. So that's one understanding of politics. And as I was thinking about the 19th Amendment, which is not a very controversial amendment, unlike the 15th Amendment, which remains a fairly controversial amendment. The 15th Amendment, which sounds just like the 19th Amendment, and I will read it in just a second, it's used the exact same boilerplate, but this is, the 15th Amendment makes it unconstitutional for votes to be taken away on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, the 15th Amendment continues to be litigated because there continues to be voter suppression targeted at the African American community. Most recently, 2013 Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder, in which the Supreme Court eviscerates part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the 15th Amendment is still a hot button issue. So far, I have not heard anybody say, you know, I think we need to suppress. That's not going on in the same way that it's going on with the 15th Amendment. So when I was thinking about how do I debate the rights, how do I talk about the 19th Amendment in such a way that it becomes something for people to wrestle with, right? I'm a constitutional wrangler. We're going to get down there, get dirty. And so the question I finally came up with, and that was yesterday, the question I finally came up with is, does politics make us better? I think that's something we're still debating. Does politics make us worse, or does it make us better? Aristotle says, clearly it makes us better. In the United States, we aren't as optimistic as Aristotle was. We have a constitution because, as James Madison said, if men were angels, government would not be necessary. So we start as devils and we become less devilish. It's an inversion. That's what the Constitution is all about. It's set up to make a devilish species less devilish. And the way it does that is through dispersing power, not just the three branches of government, but also between the states and the federal levels. Those two different levels are also arguing about things. And James Madison was thinking about who are the devils that need to be constrained so that this experiment in self-governance can actually take off. He had a certain type of person in mind. So he says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. That's how they set it up. That ambitious people from the states, because if you think about how this country started, it was a lot of ambitious people from the different colonies, which then made themselves into sovereign states after the Revolution, and they're all gathered together in Philadelphia, and they're trying to come up with a law they can all live with. I think of them as roosters. Now, I live on a farm in Putney, not too surprising. When you get roosters in a room together, you got to watch out because they like to eviscerate each other. So they set up this Constitution with a very specific psyche in mind. Ambitious people would be made to counteract other ambitious people. And for that reason, we may think, well, no wonder they only let men vote. They were only trying to deal with men's devilishness, if that's a word. So as we're thinking about the 19th Amendment, one of the issues is, if you invite women into the room, will the roosters calm down? Or will the roosters get a little more amped up? Because I know that's what my roosters do. The hens come around, they really want to strut their stuff. And is that one of the reasons why they needed to keep women out of the public sphere? Not surprising, from the beginning, women wanted to go in to the public sphere. Abigail Adams says to John Adams, don't forget about the ladies when you're designing your new government that's all about democracy and people ruling themselves. I think we'd have something to offer. And John Adams, oh, I got other things to think about. Oh, we'll get to that. So it takes a long time for women to start to really make this. In fact, 1920 is when they are able to make the case and get constitutional recognition. So before we go back to the history, let me just read the 19th Amendment, which we're all here to celebrate. And it says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." That's the first section. And then the second section, "Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." I talked earlier about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That was the sort of thing Congress did around the 15th Amendment to make sure that this same language that protected people, that states could not deny rights on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, Congress went to bat for them. So far, and there's a dispute about this, Congress has not had to go to bat for women. But they could, because this language is in the 19th Amendment. So let's go back in time, because that's what I love doing with the Constitution. We look at the text, we see what was, how the law changed, how it amended itself, which is pretty special. The Articles of Confederation could not amend themselves, but the US Constitution has in Article 5 a very elaborate method for making itself, we might say, more perfect, for amending itself. And it could do that. It was a high bar. So this is a big deal, every time you have an amendment. You need 2/3 of both houses of Congress to propose it, and then you need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. It's a big, big jump. In fact, there's reasons why we don't have more amendments than this, because we have to appeal to a massive democracy. It's not enough for a group of people on the national level to say, "Oh, okay, we all think about this in Washington, we're going to make this happen." No, you have to ratify it by each state until you hit the 3/4 line, and then you actually can pass it. So some of the questions that we're going to look at tonight, and why I'm going to invite some important historical figures to join me on the stage. You can see we've made room for them. It took a lot of seances and trances, and there may have been some sacrifices that needed to happen. But I'm happy to say I've been able to pull 6 people from the past to help us think about the question of women's rights and what was it trying to do for women, but what also was it trying to do for our democracy, to humanize our democracy. So they're going to start with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I'm sure all of you who are watching know about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She did this amazing thing at Seneca Falls. She created something called a Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. And I'm sure, oh, Elizabeth, so nice to see you. I am sure when you hear what she had to say, you'll recognize some of this language. So, yes, tell us.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted deriving their just power from the consent of the governed.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton knows how to pick an authority. She could have gone to maybe the preamble of the Constitution, but that doesn't have the glory of the Declaration of Independence. So she comes out strong. She is just like those revolutionaries who say that King George is not up to the task. And what did you tell the men of America?
He has made her, if married in the eye of the law, civilly dead.
And that's true, because if you were married to a man underneath the laws of coverture, everything you earned was his. If you wanted to sue somebody, you had to get his permission. If you wanted to sign a contract, you had to get his permission. What else?
He has taken from her all right of property, even to the wages she earns.
And you know she picked that one out in particular because the people gathered at Seneca Falls, yes, they were suffragists to a certain degree. Maybe Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the real suffragist in the crowd. But these people who had gathered were abolitionists. And they understood that if you labored, you had a right to your earnings. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton is speaking to the abolitionists there and letting them know that women are in a similar condition to slaves.
He has compelled her to commit to laws in the formation by which she had no voice.
Which is completely against the entire Republican principle, Republican in the sense of this is a Republican form of government, and that consent of the governed is a key principle of Republican governance.
He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise.
Well, okay, it's one thing to compare women's situation to slavery. Abolitionists could understand that. But to say that women should vote, that was a big statement. Not everyone at Seneca Falls agreed. In fact, thank you, Elizabeth. I've invited Meg Mott here as well. This was an easier ask because she is the great-great-great-great-grandmother of my wife, Allison Mott, so she was very amenable to coming down here. So I'm just so curious, Lucretia, what did you say at Seneca Falls?
Lizzie, they make us look ridiculous.
Yes, I mean, that's a big statement, right? I mean, Elizabeth Cady Stanton comes down. She's talking just like a revolutionary. She's talking like she wrote the Declaration of Independence. And then she says, why can't we vote? And Lucretia, why are you against the suffrage?
People are going to the polls and voting for warriors and slaveholders instead of seeking to enlighten the public mind. Far be it from me to encourage women to vote or take an active part in politics in the present state of our government.
Yeah, and Lucretia was not alone in thinking this. To vote, to get involved in politics, was to be part of a corrupt regime. Many abolitionists thought that. And so she had good reason to wonder, wait a minute, that's not what abolitionists do. We don't go and vote. We don't work inside the system. All of these people were friends with William Garrison. And if the fire laws here allowed me to do so, I would light this match. And then I would hold up the Constitution to this match, and it would burn just as Garrison burnt his Constitution, saying that it was an agreement with death, a covenant with hell, because there was slavery shot through it.
Absolutely.
And so,
It took me a long time to come around to that, however, to helping out the cause. I mean, I'm the oldest person you're going to see today.
yeah.
And yet, when I was young, my first paid employment was as a teacher. And I was very proud of that until I discovered that I was being paid half of what the male teachers were being paid.
So it's a corrupt system. Does that mean, do you think, Lucretia, that people should not vote? What do you think now?
Well, I've had a long time to think about this. And I'm still disturbed that women are only being paid 67 cents for every dollar the male earns in this day and age. However, as far as the franchise, it's critical now. Yeah. I realized that and signed the declaration on the second day of the convention, because the only way that we'll have a true democracy is by having a plurality of voices in the government.
Plurality of voices. Thank you, Lucretia Mott. Yes, have a seat. Thank you so much. So there were other people at Seneca Falls, other abolitionists at Seneca Falls, who were not as disturbed about what Elizabeth Cady Stanton had said. So I've asked Frederick Douglass if he would be willing to join us. Frederick Douglass was at Seneca Falls, and as many of you know, he was so important to the abolitionist movement because he was able to tell firsthand what it was like to be an enslaved person. He wrote beautifully about that experience. So I'm curious, Frederick Douglass, what was it about the women's suffrage? What did you say at Seneca Falls?
In this denial of the right to participate in government, not merely the degradation of women and the perpetuation of a great justice happens, but the meaning and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world.
Frederick Douglass, is this mic working? Yeah. Thanks. We were having a little technical difficulty, so I've switched mics. Frederick Douglass, can you tell us what you mean by the moral and intellectual power of the world?
This idea is evidence of the influence of European thinkers upon me regarding what it means to be human. I was, after all, speaking during the period called the Age of Reason. To be human meant, first, the ability to turn inward. Inwardness allows us to intuitively apprehend the moral law, which reveals our duty. The moral law is simple. Act only in such a way that your action can be made a universal law. And two principles are codified in the moral law. First, we all must love. And second, we must not kill. What? Life itself. And why? Because life is sacred. Intellectual power describes our universal capacity to reason and to think critically. Men and women both possess these capacities. And to deny women the right to exercise these capacities through voting is a denial of their humanity.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Frederick Douglass. Beautiful. Beautifully said. Here we get this picture that, just as Aristotle was talking about, it is through exercising our moral and intellectual powers. And Frederick Douglass highlights something Lucretia Mott was also talking about. Lucretia Mott is a Hicksite Quaker. It's a type of Quaker that believes deep inside of us we have this strong conscience. And this is exactly what Frederick Douglass is also talking about. We can turn inward and then bring that awareness to the public sphere. But that turning inward is key for this new form of politics. So what then starts to happen after Seneca Falls is we have a lot of things are going on in the United States. A lot of things. If you think things are rough now, I just want to throw out what was going on in the mid-19th century. Well, first we'll have a local hero shout out, Clarina Howard Nichols. That's 1852, 4 years after Seneca Falls. And she spoke to the Vermont legislature and petitioned them for the right to vote. The legislature at the time said, nope, we don't think so. And maybe, I know this is a shock to our Vermont audience, but when the Vermont legislature had a chance to ratify the 19th Amendment, it was slow. It was not one of the 36 states needed. The last state to put it over the finish line was Tennessee, not Virginia. I'm sorry, not Vermont. But Vermont did have strong suffragists, and so she, when she could not convince the state legislature that women should have the vote, she and her family moved to Kansas, where there was a lot of abolitionist activity going on. 1857, Dred Scott decision. And I think of that, and I'm not alone in this, as the first expression of white nationalism on the level of the nation. We have the Supreme Court, not just the state. The Supreme Court says in that case, African Americans never had, never will have the privileges of being a citizen of the United States. It was a devastating decision of the Supreme Court. 1860, Lincoln is elected president and South Carolina secedes. 1861, Civil War begins. 1863, Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address. The Gettysburg Address is important because if the Supreme Court in Dred Scott is saying this is a nation that never has and never will respect the rights of African Americans, Lincoln shifts that language to we are a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. When he says that as President of the United States, he's saying exactly the same things that Lucretia Mott and Frederick Douglass were saying in terms of that we are all created equal, and which Elizabeth Cady Stanton understood and is what motivated her to speak out at Seneca Falls for the vote. 1865, 2 years later, Lincoln is assassinated by a raving white supremacist, and the 13th Amendment is ratified, ending slavery. And Andrew Johnson, who had been governor of Tennessee, I believe, now becomes the president. He was a unionist, but he was not an abolitionist. Not that Lincoln began as an abolitionist, but Andrew Johnson was no friend of the Black American. So that's a pretty horrifying time in our history. On the one level, we're having these beautiful amendments passed. On the other level, on the level of history itself, the president is assassinated. We have a new president who has many horrible things to say about black people. And we have a Congress that is determined to give rights where they are due. So then the 14th Amendment happens. This is in 1868. It was proposed in 1866 and finally ratified July 9th, 1868. And there's many lovely, lovely things in the 14th Amendment, such as no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. These are all the sort of things that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the idea of the sacred idea of equality that Lucretia Mott and Frederick Douglass would have been behind. However, there's always a little thorn on the rose. And in Section 2, for the very first time in the Constitution, the use of the word male comes in. And it has to do with deciding who can vote, and they say at that point, they express clearly that states may not deny to any of the male inhabitants of such states being 21 years of age the vote. At that point, a door has been closed. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, what did you think about that?
If the word male be inserted, it will take us a century at least to get it out.
And she was almost right, because if you think about it, this was 1868, and it took, I have to do math fast. I think it's 52 years until women actually got the vote. So that was quite a lot of time. So, but there was this idea that there may be a suffrage amendment, and maybe that one could do the trick, because if the 15th Amendment comes forward, and it doesn't just say conditions of race, color, or conditions of servitude, maybe it could say sex as well. That's what she hoped. And if it did happen, Elizabeth, what would you see?
We intend to avail ourselves of the strong arm and blue uniform of the black soldier to walk in by his side.
And wasn't that a beautiful picture? Surely it should have happened. There was a lot of energy behind giving black soldiers. After all, they had risked their lives for the Union. And there was all this energy to expand the franchise, to make the democracy a real we the people. But the abolitionists, and I can't say I fault them, the abolitionists, such as Wendell Phillips, he said, one question at a time. This hour belongs to the Negro. And so at that point, there started to be a split between white suffragists and abolitionists. And so I wanted to complicate this a little bit. A lot of times people talk about this time in history and they say it was when all the men were black and all the women were white. Because it's very easy to see that split and to make that in our heads. But there's somebody else I wish to invite to the stage, and that is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, born free in Baltimore, lost her parents early, went to this amazing school that her uncle ran, which was where she and other African Americans in Baltimore learned literature, the Bible, and elocution. And she gave this great talk in May of 1866 at the Women's Rights Convention. And it's called We Are All Bound Together. Could you tell us that, Frances?
Absolutely. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. And society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. You tried that in the case of the Negro. You pressed him down for 2 centuries, and in doing so, you crippled the moral strength and paralyzed the spiritual energies of the white men of the country. When the hands of the black were fettered, white men were deprived of their liberty of speech and the freedom of the press.
And she's absolutely right. When the slave power was in charge, yes, African Americans were brutalized, had absolutely no rights whatsoever. But what Frances Harper is telling us is that when that happened to one portion of the population, you could not talk, even if you were a white man, even if you could vote, you could not speak against slavery in the South. If you did, don't be surprised if a knock comes on your door in the middle of the night. Tar and feathering is one of the punishments that local people gave to white people who dared to speak out against slavery. Many of you may know the story of Elijah Lovejoy, who published tracts, newspaper pamphlets against slavery, and he was eventually just murdered by a mob. I guess we would call it lynched. So when African Americans, when enslaved people had all their rights taken from them, it affected the entire country. So I'm wondering, Frances, because you're coming back and telling us what was going on back then. What did you think about this whole push about women's suffrage?
Well, I do not believe that giving women the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that, like men, they may be divided into 3 classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent.
Great. So maybe women are just like men: the good, the bad, the indifferent. So I'm curious, Frances, what did you think voting was what effect would that have on white women?
Talk of giving women the ballot box, go on. It's a normal school, and the white women of the country need it. While there exists this brutal element in society which tramples upon the feeble and treads down the weak, I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothing and selfishness, it is the white women of America.
Wow, you told it like it is. And so curious now, what do you think now that you've been around for so long and looking back on the United States and all these changes? Do you think that voting has made white women less selfish?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
The fact is that there are issues always on the ballot that will enable people to choose to vote, white women, choose to vote in a way that will just serve themselves. And also at the expense of other people. But perhaps there might be something on the ballot that might catch their attention, where they will educate themselves and become more acquainted with the needs of people other than themselves. And as a result, they may find that all people are human beings. Also, I really feel that if people, white women and all people, were to dig deep and open up their minds and their hearts, that they will be able to find the compassion to understand that people all deserve to be understood as having a dignity of life.
Right.
And to also contribute to the humanity of all life.
Wow. Thank you, Frances Harper. Thank you very much. And what you've done for us is you've really, and thank you, you can have your seat, because we're getting at this issue about the morality in voting. You could, as Frances Harper say, just go and vote your own interest. In fact, in many ways, political scientists say that's what voters do. They vote their own interests. But what we're getting from our people from the past, and Frances Harper just said it so clearly, is that we have an opportunity to think beyond ourselves when we vote. But that's going to be on us to remember that. As we start to go forward, there's a struggle that's happening. So we've heard from our guests about how important morality can be to improving ourselves as members of the polis. At the same time, imagine you're part of a suffrage organization and it wants to get things done. And so what it needs to do, right? So it's easy to think noble ideas when you are formulating something for your own path. But in a democracy, you have to persuade the majority of the American public to go with you. And that becomes a whole other problem. So suffragists get organized. In 1869, Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, and they are going for the big time. They're operating on the national level. On the other hand, there's another group, and that is the American Women's Suffrage Association, and they're building on organizing power in the states. It's much more of a grassroots movement, and it makes sense. You know, there's a reason why a lot of suffragists wanted to work in the states and not on the national level, because truly, who controls the franchise? It's the states. It's always been the states. Even with the 15th Amendment, the states control the franchise, but the 15th Amendment gives Congress the power to make sure the states are not denying or abridging the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So to work in the states makes a lot of sense. Also, women could already vote in a lot of states. Women could vote in Vermont for state elections starting in 1880, and Vermont is not alone in this. The idea that women could vote for school board, of course, because that's what women did. They thought about schools and they thought about children. So the women had that vote. Some states also allowed women to vote in federal elections. Montana, Wyoming, Utah, I think there was another state out west. They were trying to lure women to those states early on. And so women in those states got the franchise right off the bat. In fact, the first woman elected to the Senate or to Congress is a woman from Montana, Jeanette Rankin, and she was voted to Congress before the 19th Amendment because the states control the vote. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and later Alice Paul, they wanted an amendment. In fact, sometimes I think of them, they had a lot of ambition. They were willing to knock down and do what was ever necessary. They were getting to be a little bit more like roosters. I mean, this is what's necessary in politics. You got to make your stand, and sometimes other feathers are going to get fluffed up. Oh well, you make your stand. So as more and more immigrants start coming into the country, and like now, I think in terms of percentages of immigrants in the country, this is a time back then, 100 years ago, when again there was a lot of talk about immigration. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton decided to build a campaign on some of that anti-immigrant rhetoric. What did you say?
I said women's suffrage would dilute the ignorant foreign vote.
And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was not alone in this. Ignorance is something that many abolitionists, suffragists were all concerned about. That to be an ignorant American was to be a self-serving American. And so it's not at all just because Elizabeth Cady Stanton came from a certain class background or because she was white that she made that argument. Many, many people were making that argument. And it's part of trying to get the American public to say, oh yeah, better to have women than these ignorant people. And in fact, Frances Harper, I'm wondering if you would be willing to come back because you had some very interesting things to say about a certain ignorant white man who was in the White House at the time.
My objection to Andrew Johnson is not that he has been a poor white man. My objection is that he keeps poor wits all the way through.
Yes, yes. Good play on words. Poor wits. I like that. And for Frances Harper and for many women at this time, suffrage was somewhat important, but even more important is the idea of temperance. Because ignorance was not good for democracy, and drunks were not good for democracy. So the women's temperance movement starts to get a lot of attention. Do you want to tell us about why you are for the women's temperance?
Believing as I do in human solidarity, I hold that the Women's Christian Temperance Union has in its hands one of the greatest opportunities that God ever pressed into the hands of the womanhood of any country.
Thank you, Frances. That is great. So we have this idea, and it's completely consistent with what Frederick Douglass told us We have inside us a moral power. If we're drunk, we're not going to be able to access this moral power. So temperance, abolition, suffrage were all of a piece. And the idea was, and sometimes people think about the temperance movement as an early precursor to the war on drugs. As I've done more research, I don't think that's an accurate comparison. The war on drugs, started by Richard Nixon, clearly served elite interests. But the temperance movement was run by women, and it was an interracial group, perhaps more interracial than the women's suffrage movement. And it was working on behalf of women and children and wanting to change what it meant to govern in the United States, to be much more concerned with families, health, and also one's intellectual and moral capacities, and to create the conditions so that those could flourish. So at this point, we start to see two different kinds of arguments emerging. On one hand is a more, I would call it a moral argument. It's wanting to build people up from the grassroots up, and it's very concerned with moral questions and improving human capacities. The second argument, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton is going to tell us this one, this argument is much more on the level of the individual, their rights, and it's getting back to those basic fundamental Republican virtues of independence.
The point I wish plainly to bring before you on this occasion is the individuality of each human soul. Our Protestant idea, the right of individual conscience and judgment. Our Republican ideal, individual citizenship.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that's such a fine formulation of one of these things. If the purpose of government is to protect liberties, that's what you have given us, all those liberties that are so central to our form of government. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, before you sit down, I'm just curious, what do you think of our democracy now?
Thank you, Dr. Mott. I, like Lucretia, have had many, many years in order to observe the American democracy, observe our women out there voting, moving things. And I say that our democracy now it suffers the same flaws that I was fighting for in the 19th century. It's part of the same argument. And I see my own conflict being an ardent abolitionist with racist thoughts, starting to percolate through or continuing to percolate through today's society. What I am encouraged by is the spirit and the fervor of the people for the franchise, of the people to vote. Watching the long lines of patient people voting in the primaries, whereas it was absurd, and I would have organized it better, was nonetheless an optimistic moment for me, and I think for our country, at the fervor that we have for the franchise.
Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, these pictures, we can think about all these people waiting and all the work that you did and all these people, all the arguments that were made over the course of a long, long time, 1848 to 2020. That's a long time. And people are still out there now. Another speaker that I'm going to invite to the stage is W.E.B. Du Bois. And he's important because he wrote a speech that he read to the Women's Suffrage Convention, the National Women's Suffrage Association Convention. And he wrote this prior to the 19th Amendment, So it's at a time when things are heating up, and some women, some suffragists are getting more and more impatient, and they're trying what they can. So Mr. Du Bois, can you just read us a little from what you said back then?
Be careful of your reasoning. It has been said in America, if paupers and Negroes vote, why not college-bred women of wealth and position? Such argument or neglect is both false and dangerous. And while its phrasing may be effective at times, it represents a climbing of one class on the misery of another.
Thank you.
If we stress the responsibility of the state for the education of its citizens as prior to political rights, then the conclusion is that if the state allows its citizens to grow up in ignorance, it ought to suffer from an ignorant ballot. That is the threat of ignorant votes that make good schools.
Right, the threat of ignorant votes should be motivating the state to make better schools or to provide more opportunities for students to become aware of civic values, to practice speech making, to practice deliberation, to practice counter-arguments and rebuttals. So Du Bois turns all of this around. It's not on the ignorant voters that should be shunned. It's the state itself that needs to, up its game, let's say, and take care of what needs to get taken care of. Would you be willing to read what you had said about democracy as well? And then I've got another question for you.
Democracy is a method of realizing the broadest measure of justice to all human beings. In the last analysis, only the sufferer knows her sufferings. No state can be strong which excludes from its express wisdom the knowledge possessed by mothers, wives, and daughters.
That is so beautiful. And this is getting at something Francis Harper also told us. We need to be open and listening and being open to hearing about each other's suffering. So, Mr. Du Bois, I have another question for you, and take your time with this. Have we learned more about people's sufferings because women now have the vote?
Well, since we are speaking of that segment of American society, black men and women, which also applies to First Nations people as well, who are presumed to be ill-informed, naive, ignorant, and politically illiterate, who the sciences of phrenology and eugenics declare to be biologically inferior, and Southern law still regards as being only 3/5 human, whom Christian ministers regard as being preach and teach to be the cursed descendants of Ham, thus subservient creatures in the eyes of God and man. No. I'm not persuaded that the full suffering of black women, especially, has been understood in America, even as white women deservedly have received the right to vote. Consider, for example, the case of Anna Murray, wife of Frederick Douglass. If you should read in the textbooks of historians over the last century, you would find that almost unanimously they all declare that she was illiterate because the only words that she could read were two: Frederick Douglass. But I wish to contend that she herself was intellectual. She was intellectual because she possessed moral aptitude and mother wit. Born in 1815, she was born in a family of 7 children, and she was the 8th. 1 month before her birth, her family was manumitted to freedom. She was born free, thus the mantle of liberation fell on her shoulders. And she became the liberator not only of her parents, but of her siblings, for she took 3 of them with her to Baltimore. And while in Baltimore, she met a young man who was so articulate that he got her attention. They soon became engaged. I speak of Frederick Bailey. Frederick Bailey was a slave, and his fiancée was free. But Anna Murray sold her bedding to earn money to pay for his ticket as he escaped from freedom. And he soon called for her once he reached New York, and they settled down in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And there they had 4 children. And while he was campaigning for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society as a lecturer, she became the queen of their home. And she managed the domestic space and raised the children virtually by herself. Now, I believe that though illiterate, Anna was not only her husband's equal and co-partner, but she deserved to vote. But she was never permitted to vote because she couldn't read or write.
Thank you very much, Mr. Du Bois, for bringing this other level in here. Ignorance, calling people ignorant is another way to disenfranchise people. And this idea that somehow you have to be able to read in order to participate in democracy, especially if we think of what Mr. Du Bois just told us in terms of we need a moral character, then you've just introduced another element into what it really means to vote. So I want to bring us now to almost that time, right before the 19th Amendment is passed. And I've asked Jane Addams to come up. And Jane Addams has a very interesting take on democracy. Like everybody here on the stage, she understood that all people were equal. She was influenced by the Hicksite Quakers, as was Lucretia Mott. And as a young woman, she determined that she needed to do something with her life. And it's true, she needed to do something with her life because otherwise she felt so depressed, so meaningless. And the idea of just becoming a married woman, oh wait, I don't know if people at home can hear this, but this signals 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock in Putney? We are chiming for the essential workers. We are chiming for the people who can't read, some of them. We are chiming for people who maybe can't read English. We are chiming for people who are going out and doing the work, putting their lives on the line in order to care for the sick. So we have this little break here to let us know 8 o'clock. An ongoing tradition. You can see it's COVID. You can see it's COVID with the masks. You can also hear it's COVID with the bells, reminding us of all the other people who are out there working to make our country a little bit better. This, I think, is something Jane Addams would have greatly appreciated. A town putting the working people, the essential workers first. So Jane Addams, I'm going to go on with her story, because what she did at Hull House in Chicago was she used some of her savings, her inheritance, and she bought this old mansion that had gone to ruin, because around this mansion were a lot of immigrant communities. And what she wanted to do, she got this idea from a settlement program that she saw in England. And the idea was, Toynbee House is what was in England, that you took young people who were feeling lost. And like nowadays, 100 years ago, what was the meaning of life? Great inequality, great ideas, and at the same time, terrible, terrible poverty and terrible, terrible racism. So what Jane Addams decided to do is she created Hull House. She had invited the neighbors in. They had social clubs. They had debates. She would have the socialists come in from recent immigrants from Eastern Europe who were talking about the party, who were talking about class conflict. She'd have industrialists come in who would try and make an argument for capitalism. They would have to deal with the with the socialists. So she loved it to have people together debating and deliberating. Right before the vote, this is 1913, Jane Addams, and thank you so much for joining us tonight, joining this lovely group we have of our ancestors, helping us to be better citizens. You wrote this piece that was called If Men Were Seeking This Franchise. And she imagined a matriarchy. And in the matriarchy, they were already practicing in her mind the best form of government. She called it enlarged housekeeping. She understood that women would be great leaders because they were so interested in the young, in caring for people, and also in human flourishing. It was not paternalistic, nor was it so I'm a political theorist, and sometimes when I hear these things of one group trying to help another group, it can also feel like colonizing a mind. This was a totally different picture. She wanted to open it up so that all these different people could talk. And in this imagined matriarchy, where the type of government that she imagined was already in place, it turned out the men did not have the franchise. And so she imagined the men pleading with the matriarchs, oh, please, 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 can we have the vote? And Jane Addams said the matriarchy had 3 different reasons why these men could not vote. Jane, I so appreciated this article. Can you tell us what was the first reason?
Thank you, and I do have a copy of the article with me.
Oh, great.
But the first reason, every time a gun is fired in a battleship, it expends $1,700, as much as a college education. And yet, you would be firing off these guns as mere salutes, with no enemy within 3,000 miles, simply because you enjoy the sound of shooting.
Oh my, I still think that's the truth sometimes, especially when these big warships, and you can see them all going places. Yes, that's a very good reason. What was your second reason, Jane?
Well, my second reason. We are told that in certain states, children are taken from their beds in the early morning before it is light and carried into cotton mills, where they are made to run back and forth until their immature little bodies are so bent and strained that they never regain their normal shapes.
And that one was probably where you had the most influence, because we started to get labor laws in this country and child labor laws in this country. That is a great argument for why men shouldn't have the vote. What was your third reason?
Indeed. The United States alone spends every year $500 million more on its policemen, its courts and prisons than upon all its works of religion, charity, and education.
Wow. We could do that now. We could say, what is the budget to incarcerate so many people? There's over 4 million people in the United States under supervision. That's not just incarcerated, but under supervision of the state. And then we might look how much money is spent on education or philanthropic activities. So before you sit down, I'm so curious, Jane. Did you expect that the United States would change when women got the vote?
Well, my dear Professor Mott, as I sit in that great settlement house in the sky and look down many years later, I would say that we did not seek suffrage to tell women how to vote. We sought the right to vote and the power that accompanies such rights. Women manage the households, the families, with safety in mind, efficiencies in mind, with love and compassion. I believed that would be how they would run the government, or the qualities they would look for in a candidate that they would choose. But make no mistake, my dear professor, power must be accompanied by education, so that those who wield it, or those who choose who shall have it, are able to seek and see truth and choose with the responsibility to move our great society forward. Professor, my glass is half full, not half empty.
Yeah.
But we are far from done. And I do want to give a little shout out to Kamala Harris.
Oh, I bet
Thank
you were
you,
happy to see Kamala Harris there. That's great. Thank you, Jane. Thank you so much. So we're just about coming down to the end, but there's always this question. Okay, the 19th Amendment did pass, 1920. The franchise was doubled. People are usually curious. Wow, did everything change? Because right after the 15th Amendment, when the franchise was open to African American males, things did change in this country for a very brief time during Reconstruction. However, there was this change where senators and congressmen from southern states came to represent their states, and they were African American. And that was one of these great tragedies of the United States. We began, Du Bois has a beautiful line, the slave stood for a moment in the sun, and then was into the shadows. So, for women, what happened after the 19th Amendment? Well, we know there was already one woman in Congress from Montana. She got in under state law. Voting patterns and partisan alignments in the United States stayed exactly the same. Even though a Democrat was in office, President Wilson, when women got the vote, the next two presidential elections put conservative Republicans in the White House, Hardin and Calvin Coolidge from Vermont. Electoral turnout from women was less than among men. And even though women got the vote, they did not have the right to sit on juries or to hold political office. That required more activity. And this idea of enlarged housekeeping that Jane Addams had this idea that maybe if women were in charge, it would have a different set of priorities, less money for the military, less money for prisons, and less money for, now I can't remember what the third one is, child labor and profit. Maybe the priorities would change. We did see that for a moment. And that was, I think, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with the appointment of Frances Perkins as Secretary of Labor, and a lot of those labor laws started to change. So we have these great moments, and then we recede. I don't subscribe to the notion that the 19th Amendment made us better. I think that the history of the United States is one of going forward and then receding, and going forward and then receding again. And as many of our speakers tonight have told us, we are again at that moment. Are we going to go forward using our moral powers, our intellectual powers, just the sort of things that Frederick Douglass was talking about? Are we going to be aware, as Lucretia Mott told us, of the candidates being connected? In the old days, they would have said slaveholders, and today I would maybe call vulture capitalists in a same category. Are we going to have that same sort of concern? Francis Harper told us, are we really going to be selfish and think about our own needs, and that's what we do when we go to the ballot box? Or are we thinking about the concerns of everybody? And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, because she had a long, long career as a suffragist, and some of the things she said, maybe she wouldn't say now about foreign ignorant votes. I'm going to guess that may be true. But she really honed in on the idea of rights are important. And yes, we want to be moral, and we want to be intellectual, and we also want to think about freedom and how important freedom is. So I'm going to stop our presentation now. I want to give a big shout out to all of our speakers who've come in, and then we're going to open it up to question and answer. So first, applause for what we've had tonight. This is great. The last few times I've been talking about amendments, they've all been on Zoom. So there's nothing like that. So we're getting the best of both worlds right now. We have an audience all over the place, and then we have people here. And just so the in-house people know, the people at home know, yes, people are wearing masks. Everybody except for me, we're socially distanced, so we are taking COVID very seriously here. But I want to introduce these fabulous people who shared in the production tonight. And we start over here, Robin Stern, who's vice president of the Next Stage Board. She's a retired attorney, was with Phillips, Dunn, Shriver, and Carroll, formerly known as the Potter Stewart Jr. Law Offices. We also have Adrienne Major, professor of literature at Landmark College, and she's on the board of the Vermont Humanities Council and vice chair of the Westminster Democratic Committee. And many of you around here know Adrienne Major because she is a delight to see on the stage and has directed many Shakespeare production as well in the park, not this summer, yeah. Joyce Rogers, and she is a professor of the humanities at Landmark College. And she let me know right before we came on that she was born 100 years to the day after Elizabeth Cady Stanton delivered the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls. So if that is not another reason to just be so pleased that here she is with us this evening. And here we have Samira Evans, who people around here may know as part of the Samira Evans and the Handsome Devils. They've performed in Putney many a time. Allison and I had a very nice time dancing to those Handsome Devils. She is a performer and recording artist known for her dynamic and soulful approach to music. And yes, she has the wide variety. I have danced like this to her music, and I heard her sing at a funeral, and I felt I was transported to the heavens. Beautiful, beautiful voice. Samira is here because after being in Katrina for a long time, Katrina forced her and her husband Chris, Next Stage board member, to Brattleboro. It's been very happy for us here in Brattleboro because we get to dance to her music, and she is also a instructor of voice, teaches jazz voice at Williams College. And finally, I didn't think I could do this tonight unless John Grayson said yes. And that's because John Grayson, when he speaks about Frederick Douglass, this is a passion for a long time. He was a teacher at Mount Holyoke for 37 years, And he's now working on a book on the women who shaped the mind of Frederick Douglass. He is a specialist in 19th century German and American philosophy of religion, and he has taught at Aristotle University in Greece, the Vatican, the American Academy in Rome, and the University of Tübingen in Germany. Sorry for my pronunciation. And he has spent his entire career investigating religious and humanistic understandings of freedom. So I very much wanted John on board. Thank you so much, John Grayson. Okay. So we may have some questions coming in. Is there any? No. Allison says there are no questions coming in, which means technology sometimes doesn't let people do what they want to do. And I'm curious if there are any questions from our audience here or from any of the people on the stage. Allison, did you have a question?
Well, I'm just wondering if you wanted to say anything more about Vermont. Why were we so backwards?
Yeah. So how did this happen about Vermont? Well, I mean, Robin and I have been going back in emails about this. Like, why did Vermont not sign on? And it certainly had a strong, I mentioned the suffragist who went to the Vermont legislature, I think it was 1852, and then ended up going to Kansas. So it's not as if Vermont didn't know about the suffrage movement for a long time. We also have here local legend Lucy Daniels, who refused to pay her municipal tax because she didn't have the suffrage. She was a friend of Alice Paul's. She really encouraged Alice Paul to make the women's suffrage movement, or to recognize within the women's suffrage movement the contribution of African Americans. So it's not as if Vermont didn't have strong voices pushing for the suffrage. And I don't know, I mean, I am a political theorist, so I tend to think on these big questions. I'd say one reason is Section 2 of the 19th Amendment says Congress has the power to enforce it. And if you're a member of a state, you don't like that. Why should Congress ever tell you what to do? So that may be one explanation. The governor at the time, whose name was, Clemens, who was sometimes a Democrat and sometimes a Republican. He was kind of interesting. So it wasn't party politics, but he was very much against prohibition. And as we found out this evening, prohibition, the women's temperance movement, was a strong part of the suffrage campaign. So that may be another reason. I don't know. Tennessee got it, got the glory, Vermont not. Okay, are we getting some questions? The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Yeah. Yes, we have, this is Potter Stewart Jr.
Do you have any idea how our sister states in New England voted with regard to the 19th Amendment?
So,
and if they voted differently among themselves, was there any particular reason that you discerned that?
The question is, amongst our sister states, did they vote differently than Vermont? The answer is yeah, and Vermont was an outlier in New England. The other New England states were, okay, we're getting on board with this. This makes sense to us. So do I have an explanation? This is why I love being a political theorist and not a historian. I get to theorize. And I don't know why Vermont. I mean, I think the temperance piece may have been a bigger deal in Vermont than in the other states. I don't know that for a fact. But many New England states thought that the temperance movement was absolutely necessary and that people were misbehaving, men were wasting family's income on drink. They were treating their children and their wives terribly. And so there wasn't this sense that prohibition was anti-freedom. And it became understood as anti-freedom. So maybe if I were to hypothesize as a political theorist, I would say Vermont, which notably banished slavery first within its state constitution. So freedom and unity is the two ideals of the state of Vermont. It's on our seal, not like a oceanic creature. It's on that other seal. And I'm gonna guess, so I'm totally speculating here, I'm gonna guess that freedom was understood, if I wanna drink, I'm gonna drink. And if women get in charge, gosh darn it, they're gonna start telling me what I can do with my own body. And I'm gonna imagine that that was against that Vermont independent spirit of freedom. It's a pure theory. Yeah, Allison's got more questions.
We have a question here. How can we make progress with regard to the 15th Amendment?
Oh, okay. I'm going to read. Did I read the 15th already? But just, oh yeah, how do we make progress with the 15th Amendment? The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, and I think that was a way to give the 15th Amendment a lot of authority. 2013, the Roberts Court decides in Shelby County versus Holder that certain elements which gave Congress the right to oversee what states were doing and put certain states in a category, it's called the pre-clearance. They had to be pre-cleared to make sure that their voting stood by the 15th Amendment. And the Roberts Court got rid of that. So what do we do about that? Well, Congress has this authority under the Constitution. And the Supreme Court may have told them that some elements of it they need to back off on. And it may mean that the Congress needs to provide more data on specific counties, perhaps, and what specific counties are doing to repress the vote. And with that kind of evidence, I want to believe that the Supreme Court would back this new legislation that I could imagine. So, a question from...
Another question.
Yes. Oh, good. Do you want to take a mic and jump into that?
I'd like to suggest that states be encouraged to pass laws that mandate voting centers based on population size, and they never be and that those centers will never be removed without the permission of the populations that are affected.
Yeah. Nice. Very nice. That's a great idea. Thank you so much. Yeah. Do we have any more questions? Is there time for one more, or no? We're good. All right. This is actually perfect because we were hoping this was going to wrap up before 8:30, and in fact, it is going to wrap up before 8:30, just by a hair. And once again, I wish to thank people for watching us wherever you may be on the stratosphere, and to thank our in-house audience that is so COVID distanced and well masked. I so appreciate that. And to give a big hand of applause again to our readers who came in from the past. They've had to travel through centuries to come and participate tonight. So, and thank you, Next Stage, for having us here.
Big hand.
Yeah, thank you.